Spring 1944. The Wehrmacht arrived in the valley like a mathematical equation being solved in real time. 300 men, 16 trucks, 2 half-tracks, artillery pieces that looked like industrial sculptures from a distance. They appeared on the eastern ridge at dawn, their movements synchronized and purposeful. And within 2 hours, they'd transformed raw terrain into a fortified position that overlooked every approach for 5 kilometers. Jakob Steiner watched them from his barn door, a 17-year-old holding a whetstone in hands that still smelled of machine oil, and understood with perfect clarity that he was looking at his own death. Not immediately, not dramatically, just death arriving on schedule, organized and efficient, the way Germans did everything. The other families had evacuated 3 days earlier. Wagons loaded with furniture, grandmothers, crying children, whatever possessions could be tied down with rope. Old Matthias from the adjacent property had grabbed Jakob's shoulder with fingers like tree roots and practically dragged him toward the exodus. Boy, there's nothing here worth dying for. Jacob had looked at the 43 acres his father had worked until his heart stopped the previous winter, at the barn his grandfather had built with hand-cut timber, at soil that 3 generations of Steiners had turned and planted and harvested. "There's nothing anywhere else worth living for," he'd said, and Matthias had left without him, shaking his head at the stupidity of youth. Now, watching German soldiers establish fields of fire and dig communications trenches with the efficiency of men who'd done this in Poland and France and Russia, Jacob wondered if Matthias had been right. The Germans weren't occupiers yet. They were preparing to become occupiers, which was somehow worse. They had maps. They had plans. They had 300 pairs of boots that moved in unison and 300 rifles that pointed wherever officers indicated. Jacob had a failing farm, a barn with empty stalls, and a tractor that leaked oil from locations that seemed to multiply weekly. The mathematics were not favorable. He walked back into the barn and sat on a hay bale that exhaled dust when his weight settled. The morning light came through gaps in the wall planking, creating geometry that shifted as the sun climbed. He could hear the Germans on the ridge, diesel engines, voices calling in that harsh, consonant-heavy language, metal striking metal as stakes were driven and equipment was secured. Professional sounds, competent sounds, the sounds of an organization that had conquered most of a continent and was now establishing itself on his eastern ridge like a tumor growing in familiar flesh. The tractor sat in the corner where his father had left it 9 months earlier. Before the heart attack, before the funeral, before the winter that had reduced their livestock to nothing and their food stores to nearly nothing, and their prospects to absolutely nothing. A Lance Bulldog, manufactured 1936, back when his father still believed modernization might save them. The machine was a mechanical insult to engineering. A hot bulb engine that required preheating with a blowtorch, a fuel system that ran on crude oil thick enough to pour slowly, a transmission that fought every gear change like a personal vendetta. It broke down constantly. It leaked persistently. It made sounds that suggested imminent mechanical death every time it ran. But it ran, barely grudgingly, with all the enthusiasm of a condemned man walking to execution. But it ran. Jakob stood and walked to the machine, placing his palm on the engine housing. The metal was cold, spring cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones during a night spent alone in a barn, wondering if morning would bring German soldiers or something worse. He'd been thinking about the tractor for 3 days, ever since the evacuation orders came. Not thinking about escape, the tractor's top speed was 12 kilometers per hour on flat ground, and there was no flat ground between here and anywhere safe. Thinking about something else. Something that had been forming in his mind like ice crystals growing on a window. Slowly, inevitably, until the pattern was complete and obvious and insane. Chapter 1. The Absurdity of 300 Men Against Rust. The tractor represented everything wrong with Jakob's situation. It was old when his father bought it 8 years earlier. It was obsolete when it left the factory. It was designed for pulling plows through stubborn soil, not for anything resembling combat or escape or survival. The engine produced maybe 25 horsepower on a good day. The steering was loose enough that driving straight required constant correction. The brakes worked in theory, but not in practice. The whole machine weighed perhaps 2 tons, most of that weight in the engine block and flywheel. German soldiers carried rifles that could punch holes through sheet metal from 200 meters. The half-tracks on the ridge mounted machine guns that could reduce a tractor to scrap in seconds. The mathematics remained unfavorable. But Jacob had spent 17 years on this property. He'd walked every meter of it. He knew where his grandfather had attempted to quarry stone in the 1890s and given up when the rock proved too fractured. He knew where the autumn rains collected in a natural depression behind an earthen dam that had been built before Jacob's father was born. He knew the elevation of every field, the drainage of every slope, the location of every boulder and tree and erosion channel. The Germans had maps. Jacob had knowledge. The difference mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. The quarry sat at the northwestern corner of his property, tucked into terrain that folded in on itself and became invisible from most angles. His grandfather had tried to extract building stone there, cutting into the hillside with hand tools and determination. But the rock was sedimentary and layered and fundamentally unstable. Water seeped through fissures. Frost expanded cracks. Over decades, the quarry face had developed a scree field at its base, thousands of tons of loose rock held in place by friction and geometry and nothing else. Jacob had climbed on that scree as a child, felt it shift beneath his feet, learned which stones were stable and which ones were balanced on the edge of motion. The whole mass rested at approximately the maximum angle before gravity took over. Any disturbance, any change in the delicate equilibrium, and the entire slope would transform from solid to liquid. Above the quarry, the dam held perhaps 2,000 cubic meters of water. Jacob had noticed cracks forming in the earthen wall throughout the winter. He'd meant to repair them. He'd never found time. And now the cracks had widened into fissures that wept moisture in continuous dark stains. The dam was old work, built by farmers using shovels and labor and hope. It had held for decades, but it was failing. Jacob could see it, sense it, feel it, in the way the ground felt soft when he walked the crest. The dam was going to fail eventually. Probably this spring when snowmelt added more water. Maybe this summer when summer storms arrived, certainly within a year. The drainage from the dam, when it failed, would flow naturally downhill following the old creek bed that ran along his property line. That creek bed led directly toward the eastern ridge, directly toward the German battalion. The natural topography created a funnel, channeling any flow from the dam toward exactly where 300 men were currently digging trenches and establishing firing positions. Jacob had never thought about this geometry before. Why would he? But now, sitting in his barn with a whetstone still in his hand, and German voices audible on the morning air, he thought about it intensely. The tractor could reach the quarry. The route was rough, uphill, across uncultivated ground, through terrain that would make the machine labor and complain, but possible. The tractor could pull. That was its entire purpose, pulling plows through resistant soil. It had massive low-end torque, the kind of pulling power that came from a flywheel that weighed as much as a man and an engine that turned slowly but with inexorable force. If he attached the tractor to the right boulder in the scree field, if he chose the keystone that held other stones in place, if he pulled at the correct angle. Jacob stood and walked to the barn door. The Germans were visible on the ridge, small figures moving with purpose. He counted vehicles. 16 trucks meant supplies for weeks. Artillery pieces meant they planned to stay. The command post, identifiable by its cluster of antennae and officers, sat on a terrace cut into the ridge face, directly downslope from the quarry. Directly in the path of any debris flow that might originate from a breached dam and a collapsing scree field. The mathematics were still terrible, but they'd shifted slightly. 300 men with rifles versus one teenager with a tractor remained absurd. But 300 men with rifles versus gravity momentum and several thousand tons of rock and water. The mathematics became interesting. The plan was impossible. It relied on factors he couldn't control. The exact behavior of the scree field, the timing of the dam failure, the flow pattern of the resulting debris, the Germans' positions when everything happened. It assumed the tractor wouldn't break down, which contradicted 8 years of experience. It assumed he could identify the correct boulder to move, which required geological knowledge he didn't possess. It assumed he wouldn't be killed, which contradicted every reasonable assessment of the situation. The plan was impossible, Suicidal, insane. But the alternative was watching German soldiers fortify the ridge, establish themselves in the valley, and eventually come to his farm with questions or demands, or simply take what they wanted because they had rifles, and he had nothing. The alternative was becoming a refugee, abandoning everything his family had built, joining the exodus of displaced people who shuffled westward with their possessions in carts and their futures erased. The alternative was survival without purpose, existence without meaning, breathing without living. Jakob returned to the tractor and began checking it mechanically. Fuel tank, nearly empty. He rolled the barrel of crude oil from behind the barn and began filling the tank with a hand pump, watching the thick liquid flow with glacial slowness. Oil level, low. He added oil from a can that had been sitting on a shelf since his father's time, probably old even then. The blowtorch for preheating the engine had enough kerosene for one start, maybe two. He'd need to bring more. Tools. He gathered them into a canvas sack. Sledgehammer for breaking or moving stone. Pry bar for leverage. Rope, the heavy hemp rope they'd used for hauling timber, coiled and stiff from disuse. A can of kerosene for the blowtorch refill. Everything went onto the tractor platform or was tied to the frame with wire. The preparation took 2 hours. The sun was higher now, warming the air, turning the spring morning into something almost pleasant. Birds were returning to the valley, migrants that didn't understand nations or armies or territories. They just flew north when weather permitted and built nests and raised young, the same cycle they'd repeated for millennia. Jacob envied them, briefly, then dismissed the envy as pointless. He wasn't a bird. He was a 17-year-old with a failing farm and a tractor that barely ran, and he was about to attempt something that would either destroy a German battalion or get him killed. He used the blowtorch to heat the engine's hot bulb, watching the metal glow cherry red in the dim barn light. The blowtorch flame was hypnotic. Blue at the base, yellow at the tip, consuming kerosene with a soft roar that seemed loud in the enclosed space. When the hot bulb was glowing properly, he turned the fuel valve and cranked the flywheel. The engine fought him. It always fought. But on the third rotation, it caught with a series of explosive coughs that settled into the characteristic rhythm that gave the Landsbulldog its nickname. A low, percussive thudding that sounded like a giant heartbeat, slow and powerful and relentless. Jakob engaged the transmission and steered the machine out of the barn into morning sunlight. The tractor moved with ponderous determination, every mechanical component protesting but functioning. He turned north toward the quarry, away from the German positions. If anyone was watching from the ridge, they'd see a farm boy on a tractor, probably checking his property or moving equipment. Nothing threatening. Nothing worth attention. Just the normal activity of rural life continuing, despite the war, the occupation, the soldiers on the ridge. Just a boy and his tractor, heading upslope toward terrain that held potential energy measured in thousands of tons, waiting for someone who understood the geometry to release it. Chapter 2. The Geography of Destruction. The tractor managed perhaps 6 kilometers per hour, climbing toward the quarry, and Jacob stood on the platform rather than sitting, because the jolting would have cracked his spine otherwise. Every rock the wheels encountered translated directly into his skeleton. Every rut became a vertebral adjustment. The engine's rhythm never varied. Thud, thud, thud. Mechanical heartbeat of a machine that refused to acknowledge terrain or difficulty or the insanity of what Jakob was attempting. The Landsbulldog was stupid in the way that simple machines are stupid, knowing only forward or backward, pull or stop, with no capacity for doubt or reconsideration. The route took him through the upper pasture, where his father had once grazed cattle before the war made cattle into luxuries. The grass was returning, wild and unmanaged, transforming cultivated land back into something natural. Jakob noticed this transformation with the part of his mind that wasn't focused on steering or engine sounds, or the German battalion behind and above him. His family had worked this land for 3 generations, imposing order on terrain that preferred chaos, and now chaos was winning. If he died today, the chaos would win completely. The land would remember nothing of the Steiners. it would simply be land again. Dirt and rock and whatever plants could establish themselves without human interference. The quarry announced itself through absence. The trees stopped, the slope changed character, and suddenly there was a void where stone should have been. Jakob's grandfather had cut perhaps 15 meters into the hillside before giving up, creating a vertical face that wept moisture and grew moss in patterns that suggested underground springs. At the base of this face, decades of weathering had created the scree field Jakob remembered from childhood. But seeing it now, with adult eyes and desperate purpose, he understood the scree field differently. This wasn't just loose rock. This was potential energy, stored gravitationally, waiting for conversion. He parked the tractor 20 meters from the scree field's base and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound. He could hear water dripping somewhere, the sound echoing off stone faces. He could hear wind moving through the canyon that held the quarry, a low tone that suggested empty space and confined air. He could hear his own breathing, faster than it should have been, and the thudding of his heart that seemed louder than the tractor engine had been. He climbed down from the platform on legs that felt uncertain, and stood looking at several thousand tons of rock that needed to become a weapon. The scree field was approximately 40 meters wide and 30 meters from top to bottom. The stones ranged from fist-sized fragments to boulders that weighed multiple tons. They were layered irregularly, with smaller stones filling gaps between larger ones, creating a matrix that was simultaneously rigid and ready to fail. Jakob walked the perimeter, studying the formation with attention he'd never given it before. He wasn't looking for stability now, he was looking for instability. He was looking for the single stone whose removal would collapse the entire structure. He found it 15 minutes into his search. A boulder perhaps 2 meters in diameter, angular rather than rounded, sitting at a critical junction where multiple layers of smaller stones converged. The boulder wasn't supporting stones above it, not directly, but it was blocking them, preventing them from sliding into the space below. If that boulder moved even half a meter, dozens of smaller stones would shift into the void. If dozens shifted, hundreds would follow. If hundreds moved, the entire scree field would liquefy, transforming from a stable slope into a flowing mass that obeyed different physics entirely. Jakob returned to the tractor and retrieved the rope. The hemp was old, stiff from exposure and age, but still strong enough for loads it had been designed to handle. Whether it could handle pulling a multi-ton boulder was questionable. Whether the tractor could generate enough force to move that boulder was equally questionable. The entire plan rested on uncertainties stacked upon impossibilities. But Jakob was beyond questioning now. He was committed. Not through courage, but through the absence of alternatives. He wrapped the rope around the boulder multiple times, finding natural contours that would hold the loops in place. The stone was cold to touch, damp from groundwater seepage, covered in lichen that had probably been growing since before Jakob was born. He tied the rope with knots his father had taught him for securing loads that absolutely could not come loose. Timber knots designed for logs weighing tons, tested through years of farm work. The knots felt right in his hands. Muscle memory, executing patterns, his conscious mind barely remembered learning. The other end of the rope went to the tractor's drawbar, the heavy steel component designed for attaching plows and harrows, and all the implements that made the machine useful. Jakob secured it, with multiple wraps and a knot that would either hold or tear the drawbar off entirely. There was no middle ground. Either the connection would survive the forces he was about to generate, or it would fail catastrophically. He checked everything twice, then checked it again, because there would be no opportunity for adjustment once he started. He climbed back onto the tractor platform and restarted the engine. The blowtorch, the glowing hot bulb, the flywheel cranked manually because the machine was too old for electric starting. The engine caught on the first try this time, which seemed like either a good omen or evidence that the universe was mocking him. He engaged the lowest gear, the one designed for pulling plows through soil that fought every centimeter. The one that traded speed for torque, producing massive pulling force at walking pace. He increased throttle gradually, watching the rope come taut, watching it begin to lift from the ground as tension increased. The tractor's rear wheels began to spin, digging into the soft ground near the quarry face. Jakob added more throttle. The engine's rhythm slowed, each stroke laboring under load, the flywheel's momentum fighting against resistance that wanted to stop it completely. The wheels found harder ground, found purchase, and the tractor began to inch forward. The rope creaked. Jakob could see individual fibers standing out as the hemp stretched under load. He could see the boulder shifting, just slightly, movement measured in centimeters rather than meters. But it was moving. Then he felt it, through the tractor, through his boots on the metal platform, through his hands on the steering wheel. A vibration that came from the ground itself. The scree field was waking up. The boulder's movement had been enough. Stones were shifting, finding new positions, cascading into spaces that hadn't existed moments before. The initial movement was almost gentle, rocks grinding against each other with sounds like distant conversation. Then the slope found its angle of failure and everything accelerated. Jakob killed the engine and jumped from the platform, running perpendicular to the slope, because running downhill would put him in the path of what was coming. Behind him, the scree field was transforming. Boulders that had been motionless for decades began to bounce and tumble. Smaller stones flowed like water, finding paths between larger obstacles, moving with exponentially increasing velocity. The sound was building. No longer conversation, but thunder, the deep grinding roar of stone against stone multiplied by thousands of impacts happening simultaneously. He reached higher ground and turned to watch. The scree field was gone, replaced by a flowing mass that poured down the slope like a solid wave. Boulders weighing tons bounced as though weightless. The tractor, still attached to the original boulder by rope, was dragged sideways and then buried under smaller stones that buried it completely within seconds. The wave of rock hit the base of the quarry and continued, following the natural drainage downslope, heading toward the lower valley with momentum that nothing could stop. But this was only half the weapon. Jakob ran toward the dam, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to collapse from the sprint across uneven ground. The dam sat perhaps 200 meters from the quarry, upslope but connected by topography that would channel any flow from one location to the other. He could already hear the rock slide in the distance, a continuous roar that suggested the mass was still mobile, still flowing, still carrying enough momentum to reach the German positions if nothing stopped it. The dam looked even more fragile up close. The cracks Jakob had noticed from a distance were fissures up close, gaps wide enough to insert his hand completely. Water seeped through continuously, creating dark stains on the earthen wall and muddy puddles at the base. The entire structure was failing in slow motion, held together by inertia and luck. Jakob grabbed the pry bar from his tool sack and jammed it into the largest crack, levering with all his strength. Mud and wet earth crumbled immediately. The crack widened. Water that had been seeping began to pour, and the flow eroded the sides of the opening faster than Jakob could have managed with tools. He moved to another weak point, another crack, and repeated the process. The dam was perhaps 3 meters thick at its base, but the wall was compacted earth, not stone or concrete. It had been built with shovels and wheelbarrows and human labor, and it was being destroyed the same way, with crude tools and desperate strength. Jakob could feel the dam shifting under his feet, could hear new sounds as internal structure began to fail. He grabbed the kerosene can and doused the earth around the cracks, then lit it with matches that his hands fumbled twice before catching. The flames were almost invisible in daylight, but they dried and cracked the damp soil immediately, creating new fissures that water exploited instantly. The dam was failing in multiple locations now, water cutting channels through earth that dissolved under hydraulic pressure. Jakob stepped back, then stepped back again, reading the structure's language of imminent collapse. The dam's face bulged outward, swelling like a bubble ready to burst. Then it exploded. 2,000 cubic meters of water erupted through the breached wall with violence that stunned Jakob, even though he'd been expecting it. The sound was deeper than the rock slide had been, a bass note that came from the earth itself, as that much mass suddenly mobile sought the lowest path. The flood hit the quarry floor with impact that raised spray 15 meters into the air. It mixed with the remaining mobile portions of the rock slide, combining water and stone into debris flow, a mixture that moved faster than either component alone, that carried tons of material with the fluidity of liquid and the mass of solid rock. Jakob ran to higher ground again, finding a vantage point that let him see downslope toward where the German battalion had established their positions. The debris flow was following the natural drainage, exactly as he'd calculated, flowing toward the eastern ridge like water seeking ocean. But this wasn't water. This was a moving wall of destruction, perhaps 50 meters wide and 4 meters deep, traveling at speeds Jakob estimated at 30 kilometers per hour. Faster than a man could run, faster than vehicles could escape from stationary positions, fast enough to reach the German positions in perhaps 8 minutes. He sat on a boulder and watched his weapon flow toward its target, carrying the accumulated potential energy of decades converted suddenly into kinetic force. The mathematics that had seemed so unfavorable that morning had changed completely. 300 men with rifles meant nothing against several thousand tons of rock and water moving with momentum that physics permitted, but human experience rarely witnessed. Jakob had pulled a trigger. The trigger was crude, rope and a tractor and manual labor, but it was sufficient. The rest was gravity and geology and the inevitable consequences of terrain understood deeply enough to become weaponized. Chapter 3. The sound of a continent giving way. The debris flow moved like something alive. Not alive in the way animals are alive, with intention and awareness, but alive in the way that hurricanes are alive, with momentum that feeds on itself and grows stronger as it consumes terrain. Jakob watched from his vantage point as the mass followed the old creek bed, carving deeper into channels that had been carved by centuries of smaller flows. Trees that had stood for decades disappeared into the flow and emerged as splinters. Boulders weighing tons rode the surface like corks, spinning and tumbling with the current. The sound reached him across a kilometer of intervening terrain, a continuous grinding roar punctuated by impacts that sounded like artillery fire as massive stones collided. The flow was spreading as it descended, losing some of its depth but gaining width, transforming from a concentrated torrent into a wave that was eating landscape. Jakob could see the leading edge now, a churning front of mud and stone that pushed an air blast ahead of it, strong enough to flatten vegetation. Behind the front, the flow had organized itself into layers, the largest boulders riding the surface, medium stones suspended in the matrix of mud and water, smaller material at the base grinding against bedrock and carving the channel deeper with every meter traveled. The physics were textbook. The reality was apocalyptic. 5 minutes after the dam breach, the debris flow reached the lower valley, where Jakob's cultivated fields met the natural drainage. It carved through his property line, like a knife through paper, obliterating fence posts he'd repaired last autumn, and consuming a drainage ditch his father had dug years earlier. Jakob watched this destruction with detachment. Those were his fields being torn apart, his property being transformed into something unrecognizable. But property meant nothing if German soldiers decided it belonged to them. Better to destroy it himself, as part of something larger, than watch it be taken intact. The German positions on the eastern ridge were visible from Jakob's vantage point, though at this distance the soldiers were ant-sized figures, moving with ant-like purposefulness. They were still working on their fortifications, still digging and positioning equipment, and establishing the infrastructure that modern armies required. Jakob could see supply trucks parked in organized rows at the base of the ridge. He could see the artillery pieces on terraced platforms cut into the slope. He could see the command post with its cluster of antennae and the officers who gestured at maps and directed soldiers who believed they were establishing a permanent position. None of them were looking north. Why would they? The threat was supposed to come from the west, from Allied forces advancing through France. The threat was supposed to come from partisans operating in the mountains. The threat was supposed to come from aircraft that might strafe their positions. The threat was not supposed to come from the terrain itself, from geology weaponized by a teenager who understood topography better than military doctrine. 6 minutes after the dam breach, the debris flow was 500 meters from the first German positions. It was moving at approximately 25 kilometers per hour now. Slowed by friction and the upslope it was beginning to encounter as it approached the ridge. But it was also widening, spreading across the valley floor in a front that was now nearly 100 meters across. The sound must have been audible to the Germans by now, that continuous grinding roar that suggested something massive approaching. Jacob imagined them stopping their work, turning north, trying to understand what they were hearing. Trying to understand why the ground was beginning to vibrate beneath their boots? 7 minutes. The debris flow hit the first German vehicles, supply trucks parked in what their drivers had thought was a safe location, 200 meters from the main positions. The trucks were modern equipment, Mercedes-Benz L3000S probably, each weighing several tons empty. They disappeared into the flow like toys pushed into a stream. One truck was lifted completely, rotated 180 degrees, and carried 50 meters before being buried under stones that collapsed over it like a tomb being sealed. Another truck was simply shredded, the flow's rocks tearing through sheet metal and frame as though the vehicle were constructed of paper. The Germans were running now. Jakob could see them scattering in all directions, some climbing toward higher positions on the ridge, others running laterally along the slope, trying to get clear of what was coming. The organized military unit was disintegrating into individuals concerned only with survival. Officers were no longer giving orders, or if they were, nobody was listening. The mathematics had changed again. 300 men with training and discipline meant nothing when the alternative was being buried alive. 8 minutes. The debris flow reached the base of the ridge and began to surge upslope, riding its own momentum and the hydraulic pressure of the mass behind pushing the mass in front. The flow was losing velocity, but gaining spread, transforming into a wave that climbed the ridge face like floodwater climbing a dam. The artillery pieces on their terraced platforms were positioned perhaps 30 meters above the valley floor, heights that their planners had considered safe from any ground-based attack. They had not considered attack from a moving mountain. The first artillery piece tilted as the flow undercut its platform, eroding the earth that supported the terrace. The gun was a POC 40 probably, weighing over a ton, positioned behind sandbags and camouflage netting. It tilted, then slid, then tumbled down the slope directly into the flow. The weapon that had been designed to destroy tanks was destroyed by rocks that cared nothing for armor or defensive positions. The second artillery piece's platform simply collapsed, the earth beneath liquefied by the mixture of water and mud that preceded the heavier stones. Gun, platform, sandbags, crew, everything slid downslope and disappeared into the churning mass. The German command post was positioned higher on the ridge, perhaps 50 meters above the valley floor. Its location had been chosen for visibility and communication, with sightlines to all subordinate positions. But it had been positioned on a terrace similar to those holding the artillery, and terraces were simply compressed earth, waiting to encounter more force than they could resist. The debris flow reached the command post, not as a concentrated torrent, but as a spreading wave, having lost most of its velocity, but none of its mass. The wave hit the terrace's base and began to erode it from below, cutting into compressed earth that dissolved into mud under hydraulic assault. Jacob watched the command post tilt. It happened slowly, almost gracefully, the entire structure leaning like a ship in a storm. Then the terrace collapsed completely, and the command post, tent, equipment, personnel, everything slid into the flow. The antennae that had been visible from kilometers away folded and broke. The tent fabric tore. Equipment that represented thousands of Reichsmarks and hundreds of hours of technical work tumbled and shattered against stones that had been underground yesterday. The officers who had been studying maps and coordinating battalion movements were suddenly victims of terrain they'd thought they controlled. The flow continued for another 2 minutes, though by then it had lost most of its coherence. What reached the upper portions of the ridge was mostly mud and water, with scattered rocks, still destructive, but no longer catastrophic. The debris spread across the German positions like a flood tide, filling trenches that soldiers had spent hours digging, burying supply dumps that had been carefully organized, coating everything with a layer of mud that was already beginning to harden in the spring sun. Then the flow stopped, its energy exhausted, its momentum spent, leaving behind a transformed landscape that looked like a geological wound. The silence afterward was profound. The grinding roar that had dominated the valley for minutes stopped abruptly, and in its absence Jakob could hear smaller sounds that had been masked. Water dripping, stones settling with clicks and taps as the scree found new equilibrium. Somewhere in the distance, someone was screaming, the sound carrying across the devastated landscape with perfect clarity. Then more voices calling in German, urgent and panicked, orders being shouted that nobody was following, the sounds of an organization trying to reconstitute itself after being shattered. Jakob remained on his vantage point, watching the aftermath develop. Germans were emerging from positions that had been above the flow's reach, climbing down into the devastation, pulling at mud and stones. They were searching for buried personnel, digging with hands and entrenching tools and whatever implements they could find. Some were simply standing, staring at landscape that had been transformed in minutes from a prepared military position into a disaster site. Others were sitting, heads in hands, exhibiting the body language of shock that transcended nationality or uniform. The mathematics that had started the morning so unfavorable had resolved into an equation Jakob barely understood. He had killed people. The number was unknowable from his position. Dozens, certainly, possibly 100 or more, depending on how many had been caught in positions they couldn't escape. They had been soldiers, enemy soldiers, part of an occupying force, but they had also been men who had eaten breakfast that morning expecting to dig trenches and position equipment, not expecting to be buried alive by a farm boy who understood geology. Jakob felt nothing, which frightened him more than feeling something would have. He had just committed an act that would be called heroic or monstrous depending on who was judging, and he felt as empty as the barn where his cattle had once lived. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting motionless, and began walking back toward his farm. Behind him, the Germans were continuing their rescue efforts, pulling bodies from mud, treating wounded, trying to understand what had happened. Ahead of him, his property waited, mostly intact, still his, for however long that meant anything. The walk took an hour. When he reached his barn, everything looked exactly as it had that morning. The same gaps in the wall planking, the same dust motes in sunlight, the same empty stalls. But Jakob was different. He'd left the barn as a boy with a plan and returned as something else. Not a man, not yet. But not a boy anymore either. Something in between, something the war had created, someone who understood that survival sometimes required destroying others, and that knowledge could be more dangerous than weapons. Chapter 4. 8 Minutes of Mathematics. The debris flow's actual duration from dam breach to final rest was 9 minutes and 43 seconds. Jakob had no way of measuring this precisely, but later, reconstructions using topographic surveys and flow mechanics would establish the timeline with academic certainty. What those academic analyses couldn't capture was what those 9 minutes felt like to the men caught in the flow's path. Time dilates during catastrophe. Seconds stretch into eternities. The human mind, confronted with death approaching at 20 kilometers per hour, experiences duration differently than clocks measure it. For Hauptmann Friedrich Kellner, commanding officer of the battalion's 2nd Company, the disaster began as sound. He was reviewing supply inventories inside a truck parked at the ridge base when he heard what he later described as a freight train approaching from impossible direction. He stepped out of the truck and looked north, expecting to see what? Aircraft, artillery. What he saw instead was the horizon moving, not metaphorically moving, literally moving, as though the landscape itself had become liquid. His mind rejected the information initially. Terrain didn't behave this way. Geography was static. The map on his desk represented reality, and reality didn't include mountains flowing like rivers. By the time his brain accepted what his eyes reported, the debris flow was 200 meters away and closing with speed that made running pointless. Kellner made the only decision available. He ordered his men to climb. "Hoa! Hoa!" he screamed, pointing upslope, and those who heard him scrambled toward the ridge crest. Those who hesitated died first. The flow hit the truck Kellner had been standing beside and flipped it completely, 4 tons of vehicle becoming airborne momentarily before being swallowed by churning stone. Kellner climbed, hands and boots finding purchase on slope that became steeper as he ascended, the roar behind him growing louder until it was the only sound in existence. He reached a rocky outcrop 40 meters above the valley floor and clung to it as the debris flow passed below. At its peak depth, the flow was perhaps 10 meters beneath his position. He could feel the outcrop vibrate from the mass moving past. He could feel spray, not water spray, but mud spray mixed with pulverized stone, coating his uniform and face. He could smell earth and crushed vegetation and something else, something like ozone after lightning strikes, the smell of geological forces, moving at speeds geology usually prohibited. When the flow passed, and Kellner could see again through mud-covered eyes, his company had been erased. Of 96 men, he could see perhaps 30, scattered across the upper slope like survivors of a shipwreck. The rest were buried, fled, or swept downstream beyond visibility. His command post was gone. His vehicles were gone. His artillery pieces, which had been positioned precisely according to doctrine, were somewhere under 5 meters of mud and stone. His radio equipment was destroyed. His maps were destroyed. His connection to battalion headquarters was severed. In less than 10 minutes, Hauptmann Friedrich Kellner had been transformed from a company commander into a survivor with 30 subordinates, and no idea what to do next. Similar mathematics played out across the entire battalion. Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt, commanding the artillery section, had been standing beside his guns when the flow arrived. He survived because he was athletic enough to sprint 50 meters upslope in the time available. His crews survived if they followed immediately. Those who stopped to secure equipment or save ammunition died. Schmidt watched his carefully positioned guns tumble and understood with perfect clarity that everything he'd been taught about defensive positions was theoretical. Doctrine assumed enemies with weapons. Nobody had written doctrine for enemies that weaponized geology. Unteroffizier Peter Brown, a signals specialist, survived because he'd been stringing communication wire on the ridge's upper slopes when the disaster occurred. He had perfect observation of the entire event. He watched the debris flow approach from the north. He watched it hit the lower positions. He watched vehicles disappear and men scatter and the organized military position disintegrate into chaos. His training told him to report this to headquarters. His communication equipment was buried under 10 tons of rock. The absurdity struck him physically. He laughed, standing alone on a mountainside, watching his battalion destroyed, laughing because his job was communications and he had no way to communicate anything. The mathematics of casualties resolved slowly as survivors began accounting for missing personnel. The battalion had started that morning with 312 men. By afternoon, when some semblance of organization had been restored, they could confirm 164 present. Of the missing 148, perhaps 30 had fled during the chaos and might return. The other 118 were buried, swept away, or killed by impact. The exact number would never be known with certainty because the debris had redistributed itself across 2 kilometers of terrain. An excavation would take weeks the Germans didn't have. The wounded numbered 47. Broken bones from being struck by stones, contusions from being partially buried, hypothermia from immersion in cold water, psychological trauma that manifested as trembling, vacant stares, inability to follow orders. The battalion's medical personnel, those who survived, established a triage area on the ridge's eastern slope, treating injuries with supplies they carried in personal kits, because the medical supply depot had been buried. Morphine was administered to men screaming from crushed limbs. Splints were improvised from rifle stocks and tent poles. Bandages were torn from uniforms because proper medical supplies were inaccessible under meters of debris. The mathematics of equipment loss were even more devastating than personnel casualties. 16 trucks destroyed or buried. 2 half-tracks destroyed. Both artillery pieces gone, possibly recoverable but not functional. Radio equipment destroyed. Food supplies for 3 weeks buried. Ammunition partially buried, partially scattered, unstable because High explosive rounds had been mixed with mud and water. Engineering equipment destroyed. Medical supplies mostly buried. Maps, documents, orders, everything that made the battalion functional as a military unit rather than just a collection of men. Gone. By evening, when survivors had been accounted for and immediate medical treatment completed, the battalion's senior surviving officer was Hauptmann Kellner. He gathered his fellow officers on the ridge's eastern face, away from the devastation, and they attempted to assess their situation. They had perhaps 180 functional soldiers. They had personal weapons and whatever ammunition each man carried. They had no vehicles, no artillery, no communications, no supplies beyond what individual soldiers possessed. They were supposed to be a fortified position controlling access to a strategic valley. Instead, they were refugees on a mountainside, cut off from their command structure, surrounded by terrain they no longer trusted. Was war das? Asked Oberleutnant Schmidt, the question everyone was thinking. What was that? Natural disaster? Partisan attack? Divine intervention? The officers discussed possibilities with the kind of desperate focus that comes from needing explanation to restore order to chaos. Flash flood? Wrong season. And floods didn't carry boulders weighing tons. Earthquake triggering landslide, no seismic activity reported, and the debris flow had been too directional, too targeted. Deliberate attack? Using what weapons? How would partisans move that much stone? None of them considered the actual explanation because it was too absurd. A 17-year-old with a tractor, a farm boy who understood terrain, the weaponization of geology through crude tools and desperate creativity. The explanation didn't fit any military framework they'd been trained in, so their minds rejected it automatically, seeking more plausible alternatives that didn't exist. They eventually settled on geological catastrophe of unknown origin, which was accurate enough to be useless and vague enough to avoid blame. That night, German reinforcements approached from the east, an engineering company with heavy equipment sent to support the battalion's fortification efforts. They found a disaster site instead of a military position. The engineering commander, an Hauptmann named Josef Richter, walked through the devastation with a surveyor's eye and tried to understand the geology. The flow pattern suggested origin point north of the battalion's position. The mixture of stone and mud suggested combined sources, possibly a failed dam and a concurrent rock slide. The timing of both events suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate triggering. Richter walked north, following the debris flow backward toward its source. He brought 10 men and a radio now that communications had been reestablished. The trail was obvious, a path of destruction carved through vegetation and soil, leading steadily upslope. They passed Jakob's property, saw the barn and farmhouse intact, saw a boy working in a field with hand tools. The boy waved. Richter waved back automatically, then continued following the flow path upslope. They found the breached dam. They found the collapsed scree field. They found a tractor buried under stones, still attached by rope to a boulder. Richter stood at the quarry and looked down toward the ridge where a German battalion had been destroyed. The geometry was obvious. Dam breach plus rock slide equals debris flow. Debris flow follows natural drainage equals impact on German positions. But the rope on the tractor suggested agency. Suggested someone had pulled specific stones deliberately. Suggested understanding of what would happen when those stones moved. Richter studied the rope, the knots, the positioning, farm equipment, farm knots, farm understanding of terrain. He looked back down the valley toward the boy he'd seen working, looked at the only occupied farm between here and the German positions. He said nothing to his men. He included nothing in his report beyond geological failure of dam and quarry face. Why? Because the alternative was reporting that a German battalion had been destroyed by a teenager with a tractor. And that explanation would get him sent for psychological evaluation. Because admitting that German military planning had been defeated by local terrain knowledge was worse than admitting defeat to partisans with weapons. Because some truths were too humiliating to speak aloud. The engineering company spent 3 days excavating bodies and equipment. They recovered 64 corpses. They recovered 1 artillery piece, damaged beyond field repair. They recovered scattered ammunition and supplies. They recovered enough evidence to confirm that a battalion had been stationed on the eastern ridge and something had destroyed it. But they never recovered the truth, because the truth didn't fit categories that military minds found acceptable.